All right, today we're jumping into a really complex and, let's be honest, often debated topic in Islamic theology. We're going to be looking at the nature of divine revelation and the possibility of demonic influence. Now, we'll be examining a very specific line of argument that is drawn entirely from Islamic sources, sources used to question the infallibility of prophecy. So let's break it down.
So it all really boils down to this one question. Can a divine message be messed with, even for a moment? Is it possible for an outside force, like Satan, to actually insert its own words into what a prophet is saying? This is the central issue we're going to explore today, based on the source material.
Okay, so where does this all start? Well, it begins with a verse right from the Quran itself, Surah 22, verse 52. It says that whenever a messenger or prophet recited something, Satan would throw into his recitation. But, and this is key, the verse goes on to say that Allah then abolishes or basically cancels out whatever Satan threw in. This single verse is the foundation for the whole debate we're about to unpack. So let's unpack that. What does a verse like this actually imply? This is where the first part of the argument really kicks in, focusing on how this verse could suggest a potential vulnerability in the whole process of revelation. The key here is this one Arabic word, alqa, which gets translated as through into. Now, those making this argument say this word implies a direct, literal insertion of words into the prophet's speech. Not just, misunderstanding by the people listening, but an actual intrusion. And that's an absolutely crucial distinction for their case. And that, right there, leads to a massive question. If an outside force can just slip words into what a prophet is saying, words that only get corrected later on, how could anyone listening, including the prophet himself, be 100% certain in that moment that what they're hearing is purely from God? And this isn't just a theoretical idea. It brings us to a really famous and controversial story that some early Islamic historians, people like Al-Tabari and Ibn Ishaq, directly connected to that Quran verse, the Satanic Verses incident. And this is the phrase that's at the heart of it all. According to those early accounts, Muhammad actually spoke these words, which are praising some pre-Islamic goddesses. You can imagine, that would have been seen as a huge deal, like a major compromise with the pagans in Mecca. So the way the story goes, it happened in 3 basic steps. First, Muhammad recites these verses. Second, they're later flagged as being an insertion from Satan. And third, they get abrogated or canceled by Allah, who then reveals the verse we just talked about, 22:52, as the correction. Okay, so moving on from that specific incident, the argument then widens its lens a bit. It starts looking at other accounts in the hadith that describe Muhammad's state of mind, especially during his very first experiences with revelation. And this is where things get really intense. Instead of, a feeling of divine peace, this hadith from Sahih al-Bukhari describes the prophet's first encounter with the angel Gabriel as absolutely terrifying. He was so shaken up that he ran home to his wife and said, "I fear for myself." That's probably not the reaction most people would expect. And it doesn't stop there. Some early versions of that very same hadith say that when the revelation stopped for a while, the prophet fell into such a deep despair. According to these accounts, he was so distraught that he actually considered taking his own life. It's another piece of evidence used to suggest these early experiences were anything but peaceful. So if we're following this thread of outside influence, the source brings up another set of stories from the hadith. These are the reports that detail a time when Muhammad was said to have been bewitched. This hadith is pretty blunt. It says a magic spell was cast on Muhammad, and it made him so confused that he would imagine he had done things that he, in fact, had not done. And apparently, this went on for some time. You see, the point the source is making by putting all this together is that these reports seem to show a prophet who isn't always divinely protected from harmful external spiritual forces. And it argues that this really complicates the picture. All right, this leads us to the final piece of the puzzle that the source presents. And it's a big one. It's framed as a kind of built-in test for a prophet, one established right there in the Quran. The whole idea is pretty simple. The Quran lays out a very clear, very serious consequence for what would happen to Muhammad if he ever dared to make up words and claim they were from God. Now, this is where it gets really, really interesting. Look at this side-by-side comparison. On the one hand, you have the Quran's very specific warning, a false prophet would have his aorta cut. Then, on the other hand, you have this report from the early biographer Ibn Sa'd, which says that as Muhammad was dying from the effects of poison, he described a feeling as if his own aorta was being cut. Okay, so let's take a step back and see how the source pulls all of these different threads together for its final conclusion. So, to recap the argument being made from these texts, the source points out that according to Islamic scripture, Muhammad seemed to fear his first revelations might be demonic. He recited verses that were later called satanic. He was affected by a magic spell. And then, he died in a way that sounds eerily similar to the Quran's own warning for a false prophet. And so, the ultimate conclusion drawn from all this by the source is that Islam's own holy books contain what it sees as internal evidence, evidence that challenges the idea that the message was purely divine from start to finish. And really, this leaves us with a much bigger question, one that every faith has to deal with at some point. What do you do with challenging or seemingly contradictory passages in your own sacred texts? In this case, how do scholars and believers make sense of stories like the Satanic Verses incident or the reports of bewitchment and the prophet's own fears? These are not simple questions, but digging into them is, well, it's key to understanding the deep complexities of faith itself.